Can I? Hello everyone. This is a SWAM and PTL course on the environment and development. So I hope by now you might have been part of few of the lectures, and primarily you will be looking at some of the few weeks, and particularly in the first week what we have done is familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts, particularly what development is, and also we looked at the differences between environment and ecology, and also looked at what economic growth is all about, and also how sustainable development, the very concept of sustainable development, which has come into the fore of within the environment and development. So we have also tried to cover some of the important concepts, as I had pointed out, uh, including ecosystem fragility, environmentalism, and sustainable uh, well-being. So we have also tried to interrogate and tries to see if there is any possibility of a life outside uh, our surrounding, in the sense the earth, and also looked at the differences between the animate and inanimate objects. So we then also moved to the second lecture on the basic ecosystem ecology, and familiarize ourselves with what ecosystem is, and the notions of how population growth, and the very ways in which how these farming systems have actually taken place, and then with the coming of the industrial farming, what it has impacted on the environment in general. So we have also tried to look into the different ways in which how population growth has taken place, that is the J curve population growth and the S curve population growth, and more importantly the crop rotation which has taken place. So first and foremost, what we have tried to look into this particular lecture on basic ecosystem ecology is what is environment and its influence on human being, and then what are the possible human impacts, I mean that humans have impact on the planet Earth, and uh, what is industrial agriculture, and also engages in looking at the carrying capacity. For instance, to what extent the natural surroundings or resources can actually supply or meet the requirements of the people or populace in that particular area. So in week two, we move on to familiarizing ourselves with the few notion which can be categorized under environmentalism, and or how these notions of binary between anthropocentrism and biocentrism has been created, and how the new environmentalism that is beginning from the 1960s actually emerges with the onset or with the seminal works of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So some of the focuses which have begun in the earlier environmentalism has actually been, the focus actually has changes in the new environmentalism, because the kind of population, for instance, and also the use of pesticides such as DDT, which is very much being uh, rigorously argued by Carsons as having an imprint, and it has a larger ramifications on the human populace, and at the same time how in the food chain system people are, and then animals or any other forms of organisms are being affected to a large extent. So in this lecture, we have in some way familiarized ourselves with some of the problems and focuses of how the notions of wilderness thinking or wilderness idea, which has emerges in northern countries, particularly in US, and then it has created a kind of awareness among other countries and then populations across the globe. Now, in lecture 4, we entitle as environmental movement and try to look at some of the focuses of the early environmentalism, that is on the notions of conservation and preservation, and how it has differed from the modern environmentalism. So the very focus of American environmentalism, again by some of its pioneers like John Muir, who is also known as the father of American national parks, has actually developed this idea of wilderness or wilderness thinking, and their focus was primarily based on these notions of preservation, and preservation for whom. So it was more of an elitist, and their interests were primarily, being focused on the urban populace, which again is pretty much, different from what we are going to, discuss in the next lecture. That is the notions of environmentalism in the global south. So what we have also tries to examine here is to familiarize ourselves with what actually is wilderness thinking, and what was the main focus of American environmentalism, and uh, as I had pointed out that in the earlier lecture on the environmentalism, that is beginning from the 1960s, how Rachel Carson's work has actually created a kind of a different forms, or the emergence of, or the focus of environmentalism has changed, and undoubtedly she has been also known as the godmother of modern environmentalism. So the post 1960s has witnessed a lot of changes in terms of how there is an increasing and urging needs of people being more aware, and then in terms of how their focus is primarily relies on, and the observations of the early in 1970 is also one of an epoch making, in the sense that there is a realization that uh, why people should be concerned about the impact, or the kind of implications which has on the environment, and it has also eventually led to the passings of different policies. For instance, the uh, why the polluters actually should pay for it. So the polluters pay principles was formed, and then it has also led to where nations comes together, and different countries has actually passed different kinds of policies, environmental uh, principles were being framed, and in some way it has created a certain kind of wave, so that it led to the emergence of a new form, or a modern notions of environmentalism as such. Now, moving away from that, and then contextualize, or beginning from that, we can perhaps try to critically examine the notions of environmentalism in the global south, and what are the focuses, and to what extent the northern and the southern environmentalism differs, and what are the main focus of the southern environmentalism. Perhaps one of the main focus was again the issues of livelihood, and social justice, and the kind of conflicts which revolve around this environmentalism. Now, some of the key concepts which we have tried to cover up in this particular lecture, in lecture 5, environmentalism in the global south, is post-materialism, environmentalism of the poor, environmental racism, environmental justice, ecological debt, and the omnivores versus the ecosystem people. So going on with the lecture, we have tries to questions and tries to look into some of the interrogate some of the issues, that what does ecological distribution mean, and what is meant by environmentalism of the poor, and what are the main sides of conflict in the south, and why is it that women are more in the forefront when it comes to resistance, for instance, when natural resources become degraded and privatized. So these are some of the main undercurrents which is possibly seen in the context of the global south, why environmentalism is has to do with the everyday life, and then the issues of livelihood, and why is it that some of them some sections of the populations are being marginalized while discussing this issue. So we have also taken up a case of the Karnataka Pulp Food Limited cases, where you have actually tries to where people have actually resist against the state development policies and activities, and what are the kind of strategies being deployed by some of these environmental activists, or those people who resist against the development activities in more importantly in India. So we again move on to the third module, that is approaches to environment, and over here we try to engage ourselves with three thematical lectures. The first one being ecofeminism. So in the ecofeminism, what we try to delve is to look at the nature of dominations, and also familiarize ourselves with what feminism is, and also look at the how the notions of patriarchal, or the patriarchal mindset actually have to a large extent influence the notions of the way in which how human relate to nature. So we also tries to broadly look into some of the concepts as ecofeminism, and maldevelopment, and radical ecofeminism, and also cultural ecofeminism. Now we have also looked into some of the works like Caroline Merchant, that how does Caroline Merchant explain the historical lineage of women natural linkages, and also to a large extent some of the works of Vandana Shiva, where she gives a critique of the Western form of development, and what is how do we interpret feminism from the Marxist framework, or the Marxist feminist theory. Now, moving on with that lecture, also we tries to look into the works of Mallour, where she presented the connection between feminism and ecology, and to a large extent, some of these feminists also tries to see that ecofeminism is to a large extent a spiritual movement. Now, one very important points which we should keep in mind in this particular lecture or theme is to engage looking at that particular mindset which is very much embedded in the psyche of almost every individual, and then particularly in the context of India, that why is it that men are always the decision makers. And then to a large extent, the intrusions of technology and for that matter, the use of machines to a large extent has favored the interest of many of the male members, and at the same time trying to push aside or brush aside the interest of women. For instance, in the agriculture farming, where in the traditional modes of farming, women and men more or less share the same spaces and equally, tax a decision. But when it comes to the intrusion of market economy, men actually have much more dominance in terms of decision making, and at the same time the control over production, simply because the technology which has been newly used has actually favored many of these the male members. So in next lecture, in lecture number 7, we have looked at the feminist political ecology, and in which we have particularly looked at the uh, earliest form of environmental movement in India by taking the case of the Chipko movement. So in this, it is important that we have tried to familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts such as environmental conservation, the materialist ecofeminist, and political ecology, and how this third world ecofeminism emerges, and then what are the main focuses of this third world ecofeminism. So in this particular lecture, we try to make familiarize ourselves with some of the issues such as what is feminist political ecology approach, and then what does the materialist ecofeminist focuses on. And by now I am pretty much sure that you should be familiar with what Chipu movement is and who are actually in the forefront of this resistance. And why is it that Chipu movement is not simply a resistance for the sake of preserving or conserving natural resources? It has more to do with the conflict which arises as it has to do with the issues of the livelihood concern, and why many of these people who are involved by deploying the Gandhi's notions of satyagraha, that is non-violence, by engaging in a symbolic resistance, that is by hugging the tree. So these are some of the important ways in which how ecofeminism has evolved, and by engaging in this lecture, and then if you go through those lecture slides, you would be familiar with what are some of the possible insights of eco feminism. Now moving on to our fourth module, possibly which you would be going through in this particular week, that is the debate on coming to the last lectures of module 3. We have discusses on uh, Marx and ecology, or Marxian uh, notions or understanding of ecology. So in this, through the works of some of the scholars, we have tried to look into the notions of capitalism, how it has actually changed the whole mode of productions, and at the same time how human actually being become exploited in the process and alienated from in the modes of productions. So over here we have tried to also look into the way in which how the interrelationship between ecology natures, and more importantly between the use value and the exchange value. So we have also to a large extent try to engage in looking at what social metabolism is and the dialectics of nature, and also see from the eco-Marxist framework. Now, Marx has a different, explanations about, again, the whole notions of metabolism, and some of the important notions which we also, tries to look into is the dialectical reasoning, which is very much, embedded in these notions of uh, Marxian ecology or eco-Marxism. So some of the important distinctive characteristic of Marxian ecological theory has been, delved to a large extent in this particular lecture, and trying to bring in these notions of materialism, and then also how Marx tries to engage or to explain alienations from nature, how this binary or the kind of, differences is being created between human and nature. So as I was saying, in module 2, that is on the debates of, on environmental ethics, we looked into, three important philosophers, and their contributions to trying to find a kind of alternatives and their critical engagement in uh, matters relating to environmental understanding. So the first one is the works of, the Norwegian philosopher, that is Arnes, who actually has, come up with, the notions of this deep ecology. And deep ecology actually, again, is contradictory to the notions of shallow ecology, where people are more concerned about the well-being, the health issues, rather than finding the, inner self, or the, self-realizations of what environmental issues is. So one can actually see that the works of Lin White Jr., that is in his essay, The Ecological Crisis, tries to, come up, or trace the history of how the Judeo-Christian religion was partly responsible for the ecological crisis which we are facing or confronting with. And in this particular lecture, what we have tried to look into is that Ness actually has come up what is also known as the eco-psychology or the ecosophy, where the, deep reasoning or deep questioning is important in order to have some of the, important available alternative. Now, we have also engaged with some of, the important points or tenets of deep ecology, and also look into what are the differences between deep ecology and shallow ecology, and what does Nast mean by the notions of self realizations. So I've, alongside, by providing the lecture slides, I've also, provided some of the readings. Perhaps you can, enhance and pick some of those reading materials, and try to have a much more in-depth and insights from the theme which we are dealing with. So, Gandhi, no doubt, is also important when we talk about these notions of environmental ecology, which many writers, in some sense, says that he might not have, claimed or contribute to ecology in the real sense of the term, but through his work, that is by, uh, in some way trying to provide a kind of an alternatives. So Gandhi, to a large extent, was pretty much, against this Western notions of industrializations, or heavy, use of machines, for the simple reason that he believes in the idea of, uh, notions of Hind Swaraj, or maybe you can say the self-realize. So because many of the Indian populace or the country actually can't afford to use or try to cope up with some of these drastic changes which might possibly occur. So rather, Gandhi was more in favor of the use of appropriate technology, and he was also more uh, inclined to these notions of naturopathy, that is the available resources which perhaps can be helpful, not in terms of fulfilling or providing the needs of human, but also in terms of uh, a sense of from a medical or from uh, health and hygienic sense. So this very notions of self-realization is very much synonymized with the works of Gandhi, and then perhaps from Gandhi's writings, and then uh, Arniness was also pretty much influenced by this work of him, that is particularly the how deep ecology has developed to a large extent. So, as we all know, ahimsa or non-violence, which Gandhi actually, has been, replicating all throughout his life, is to a large extent being used by today's or maybe, decades back. How I mean, since beginning from the Chipko movement, that people have actually used these notions of or deploying this non-violence movement in terms of resisting the development practitioners, and then the corporates or maybe the state to a large extent. So even till today, these notions of ahimsa or non-violence is to a large extent being used by, I mean, not confined to particularly the Indian subcontinent, but across uh, the globe. So we have, to some extent, also engaged with the notions of industrializations, and then what was the ideal view of Indian villages according to Gandhi. So Gandhi believed to some extent the notions of the Hind Swaraj, or the self reliance, where his notion or concept of ideal village is to depend, or to have to be very much self-sufficient in and around, I mean, to rely on those resources which are available around them. Now in the lecture 11, we have tried to look at into the works of Murray Bookchin on social ecology, that very notions of hierarchy which human have in the social structure has further implications and ramifications when we deal with nature. So therefore, one has to critically look into the way we deal with nature, and then these notions of dominance or oppression has to actually be uh, uh, do away with, if we are to find an alternative in this particular discussion which we talked about. So now I have discussed some of the themes and modules which we have covered so far, and in the upcoming lectures, I mean the weeks, we would be dealing with some of the modules, particularly on religion, environment, and conservation, and also on the natural resource management. Uh, so uh, the I mean the religion and environmental and the conservation would particularly look into or trace the historical roots of how these ecological crises have emerged, and shifting away from these Western notions of religion and science, we also looked into looking at the Eastern religion, particularly by uh, picking up two particular religion, that is Buddhism and Hinduism, and also tries to relook and reevaluate these notions of the Christian notions of how ecology and environment is being looked at. So in natural resource management, we also tries to look into the debates of the common versus the private property, and also familiarize ourselves with some of the issues confronting, that is the livelihoods, and then these notions of conservations vis-a-vis forest, by also taking a few issues surrounding us. So I'll stop here, and this is some of the recap or what we have done so far, and I'll try to uh, answer some of the queries which you have possibly posted here. So any questions which so in one of the file, the link which I have received, I come across the questions which is not pretty much, I'm not sure, but because there's some issues with the the spellings and all, but if I remember correctly, it talks about, can we afford to live a carbon free surroundings. So I don't really have an accurate answer to that, but then to live a carbon-free surrounding, again, we have different formulas which we have discussed. For instance, by relying on the three R's, that is reduce, reuse, and recycle. Perhaps the carbon footprints which we have on this planet Earth would have, to a large extent, be reduced considerably, and also by engaging at the minimal individual level of not to exploit the resources, but rather uh, plant more trees, for instance, or maybe use water much more wisely, and also engage, utilize or exploit more of the energy efficient modes of transportation, for instance. So therefore, when we talk about these notions of to act responsibly, or become a responsible citizen, when it comes to these notions of environmentalism, it again boils down to the individual, because the individual also to some extent have a bit of from our part, uh, can to a large extent contribute immensely to sustainable well-being, or sustainable use of resources. So if we I don't seem to have any other questions, so I'll stop here, and we can perhaps interact again in the next live sessions, and then please feel free to share or post questions, doubts if any, and then regarding the assignment, and then the various other doubts you have, I will be happy to respond.